Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. We are pleased to have in our audience for this afternoon members of the Philadelphia Council, folks who have traveled with us on our educational tours who reside all over the United States, members of some other World Affairs Councils from around the nation, some of our high school students, college students, and teachers who are part of our educational programs. So welcome to you all. I want to thank those of you who are participating who used our pay what you want option for the event. Obviously, our revenues, like those of so many others, have been hit in the current circumstances. We do need your ongoing support, and we appreciate those who've provided it. If you have any technical issues that come up during the program, our Vice President for Programs, Haley Boyle, is available behind the scenes, and you can reach her through the question bar to get your issues resolved. Later in the hour, we will be taking some questions from this audience. In order to ask a question, we ask that you type it into the questions bar. If your question is selected, I'll either read it out loud or if you don't have microphone access, or we can unmute your microphone and you can be heard by the audience if you prefer. Again, Haley Boyle, our Vice President of Programs, will assist you with the question process. So with that, on to our discussion for this afternoon. We are so pleased to have with us, I should say back with us, because he has been a guest of the Council in the past, Dr. Nicholas Burns. Ambassador Burns, currently a professor at Harvard, has a extraordinarily distinguished career at the most senior levels of American foreign policy making, serving as principal State Department spokesperson under President Clinton, and as both the American ambassador to the United Nations and then Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the third ranking position in the State Department under President George W. Bush. We've asked Ambassador Burns to make just a couple minutes of opening remarks, kind of set the table for us this evening on this subject of how to lead in a time of pandemic, followed by a conversation between the two of us, and then of course we'll get to questions from you. So Ambassador, welcome.
Craig, thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to me to be with the Philadelphia World Affairs Council. I wish I could be with you in person in Philadelphia, which is one of my favorite cities, and I have a lot of friends there. But alas, we are living at an extraordinary time, and we're still social distancing in Massachusetts, where I live, as I'm sure you are in Pennsylvania. Just two corrections, and I just have to do this to be accurate in the bio. I'm not a doctor. I don't have a PhD, and that's an important distinction in academia. And I was an American ambassador to NATO between 2001 and 2005. But Craig and I have a conversation. He's been nice enough to offer me to just open with a few words. I wanted to make 3 points to this audience about how Americans should think about the global dimensions of the crisis that we're experiencing. First, I certainly think, I know a lot of people do, that the combination of the pandemic and the global economic crisis is probably the most serious challenge the American people have faced since the Second World War. We all know about the pandemic because we've all been living it. We've got about 5% of the global population here in the United States, and yet we have 1/3 of the global deaths. And that just means to me, and I'm not being partisan here, is that when the coronavirus is passed, and I think that's probably the time to do it, I hope the Congress and President Trump or President Biden, whoever's president, will form a 9/11 type commission, nonpartisan, Republicans and Democrats, to think through what went wrong in the United States. Why is it that we had so many more people infected, so many more people who passed away from this disease than other countries our size, comparable or larger populations, other countries of our economic level? I think that's going to be very important for us to do that. And it's going to take the combined efforts of both of our political parties, hopefully acting together, and all of us as Americans, whether we live in red or blue states, to work together if there's going to be a second wave or to prepare for the next pandemic, because one is surely to come. That's my first point. My second point is I think the most disturbing aspect of the pandemic and the economic crisis from a foreign policy perspective has been the way that China and the United States have spent nearly all their time arguing with each other instead of working together. China certainly has a lot of is to blame for much of this, but not all of it. And my own view is that President Xi Jinping and President Trump ought to go out of their way to put aside the real differences that we have, to work together on the search for a vaccine, and then to decide how we can distribute a vaccine equitably among 7.7 billion people in the world, and to work together to mitigate the worst aspects of the economic crisis. So that's point two. I'm sure Craig and I will want to talk about that, and you will too. The US-China relationship is in very bad shape. Final point, Craig, before our conversation would be about the United States itself. It made perfect sense to me that our initial reaction here in March in the United States was to focus inside on our own country, because we have to take care of our own citizens first. And we had to be, you in Philadelphia and we in Boston and Massachusetts had to be focusing on our hospitals and equipment for doctors, and that just made sense. And the primary obligation of our government has to be our own people first and protect the American people. But there's also an international dimension to this crisis. And that is some of the things I've already talked about, the search for a vaccine on the pandemic side. On the economic side, this is a global economic crisis. So we have to think and act globally. And I must say, I'm worried about our government. I think our government, for the first time in 75 years, since the end of the Second World War, the United States has actively chosen not to lead globally in a major global crisis. That has real implications for us. I don't think it's in our national interest. I think it'll hurt America. I hope we talk about that tonight. What are our responsibilities, both inside the country and as we work with the rest of the world? So, Craig, thank you. Looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Let me pick up right where you left off on the question of U.S. leadership or lack of leadership in this moment in history. It's a consensus, it seems to me, in the foreign policy establishment in our country that we have stepped aside from the kind of role that we have played since World War II in key moments like this. I guess the question I want to ask you is whether you think that is more a failure of competence, a sort of failure of execution on policy, or does it actually reflect that this administration has a different philosophy, has a different view of the role of the United States in the world, and has intentionally acted in a way that's different than all of its recent predecessors?
Oh, I think this is quite intentional, Craig. It's the policy of the Trump administration. President Trump, I would not describe him or his administration as isolationist. I would describe them as unilateralist. And he has made abundantly clear for 3 years now that he believes the United States is best off when it's acting alone. And that's why he took us out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, why he's effectively taking us out of the World Health Organization, the only organization that can pull the world together on the pandemic, and why he's been so dismissive of the NATO alliance in Europe and our East Asian allies in Japan, South Korea, and to a lesser extent in Australia. And I profoundly disagree with President Trump on this issue. It's one of the reasons why I'm a vocal opponent of his, as are many people, and I'm supporting Joe Biden. And I'm advising Joe Biden on his campaign, which, by the way, is based in your city, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I think this is an important issue for Americans to reflect on. What made America great, in my view, over the last 75 years since our victory in World War II, was the fact that we had our alliances, that they're the great multiplier of American power, that they share the burden. I saw this at NATO when we went into Afghanistan and Iraq. The allies shared the financial burden. They contributed tens of thousands of troops in Afghanistan. Their taxpayers helped to pay, as did ours, for the effort, and they made us stronger. And President Trump doesn't believe in that. And so I think he feels comfortable leading in a time of pandemic, which is the title of our session tonight, really with the US alone. And I'm convinced that the US would actually, it's in our interest in the pandemic, in coping with it, and certainly in terms of dealing with the economic crisis, if we're working internationally particularly with our best and closest allies that are all democracies. So there's a big difference here between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and I agree with Joe Biden on this seminal issue.
So it seems to me that the America First thesis that you're describing President Trump and his administration as pursuing, even in these circumstances, it sort of amounts to a view of the United States as Gulliver being tied down on the beach by the Lilliputians, right? And sort of needing to break free in order to exercise our exceptionalism and indeed our scale. Your argument is that we will benefit from the cooperative, collaborative approach, even if it is among a group that are not equals in some respect. Do you think that's sort of a fair way to look at the difference?
I do, Craig. I think you described it quite well, and I just make 2 points, and just to embellish what I said, and just to answer your direct question. Point one is, we're still the most powerful country in the world if you measure power by economic weight, military power, political influence, cultural power. And I want the United States to be the most powerful country in the world. I don't want to live in a China-dominated world. But the gap between us and China is narrowing. And the gap between us, the United States, and India is narrowing. And so we can no longer rule by fiat. We have to probably use the military less in the future. And we're going to have to think creatively about using diplomacy more to get our way in the world. And most of the conflicts we're going to face, climate change, dealing with pandemics, dealing with a range of cyber threats, they generally will lend themselves to diplomacy, forming coalitions to get our way, using NATO to get our way politically rather than trying to use military power. And that means you've got to be working with allies. And my second point would just be to illustrate it quite vividly. I was the American ambassador to NATO on 9/11. And when we were hit really hard, and 3,000 Americans were dead in New York and Washington and in Pennsylvania in the crashed airplane, my phone started to ring in Brussels, Belgium, at NATO headquarters, where I was the American ambassador, and it was the Canadian ambassador and the British ambassador and the Dutch and Italian and Polish ambassadors. We want to help you. We want to go to war with you. We want to be with you. And we invoked Article 5 of the NATO Treaty the next morning. We had never done it before, which said that all those allies pledged to go into Afghanistan with us. And you know what? They did. Every single one of them. And the great majority of them are still there 19 years later. They've suffered over 1,000 combat deaths, our allies and partners, many thousands wounded. They've put money into the effort to help us. Why would we want to live in a world without those kind of allies? Why would we want to be dismissive of them and ridicule them the way the president has ridiculed Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany? I don't get America first. I think America first means really America alone, our taxpayers shouldering the burden, and our soldiers doing all the work by themselves instead of these big multinational groups in both Europe and Asia. We have Japan, South Korea, and Australia as our great Asian allies. That reinforces the United States. It makes us more powerful. And I think that's an issue also that we should be debating in this campaign.
So one of the traditional roles that we have played in the post-war era would be to be a leading contributor to humanitarian problems around the world, both with boots on the ground and with dollars. So let's bring us up to the present. Given that we are facing this sort of near depression condition in our own economy, and the fact that you described that the pandemic has hit us for whatever reason harder than any other country, would it be reasonable to believe that the United States should be providing economic aid or material support to help with pandemic relief, even in the poorest countries, or do we in fact have to keep those resources at home?
You know, I think we can probably do both, but I'd say, Craig, as a citizen, I certainly believe and want our government to pay attention to our own people first. That's what every other government in the world does, and that's the proper way for public health to work around the world. And so it makes sense that President Trump would focus on the U.S. first. That the governor of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts would do the same in their own states. And I think that'll continue in a pandemic. But it doesn't mean that we can't be helpful, especially to those countries that are less fortunate and less wealthy than the United States. Bill Gates has been saying he thinks when all is said and done with the coronavirus, when it's all through, and we all can't wait for that day, he thinks that 2/3 of the dead globally will be in the developing world by the end of it. Because we're looking at now the ravaging of Brazil and of India in particular right now, as we've kind of passed the peak, fortunately, in places like Philadelphia and Boston. And President Trump said the other day, and I agree with him on this, he said, look, we don't need the ventilators right now that we needed a month and a half ago. So we're going to be donating or lending some ventilators to the government of India. We can certainly do that, as long as we know that we've planned well enough and we're organized well enough. And that's the job of the federal government, to help the states get organized, so that if the second wave hits, we've got enough masks, N95 masks, we all know this now, PPE, and ventilators to help the American people if the second wave hits or if the next pandemic hits. And so I think I'd make that distinction. We can certainly help the countries less fortunate than ourselves and pay attention to our own people.
So let's go back to, you raised the critical issue of China, US-China relations in this context. There's been talk of a new Cold War between the United States and China ever since President Trump's election. Clearly, the current circumstances have made those tensions much worse and much more public. Do you think that a relationship that is more collaborative and based on an acceptance of interdependence in the way that you've described can be restored, or is it really prevented by domestic political considerations in both countries, with the populations, perhaps itching for a fight?
Well, you've asked a $64 trillion question. I think it is the biggest question in American foreign policy today, your question, Craig. I tell my students, I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School up here in Massachusetts, I say, particularly the young Americans, getting China right is going to be the most important question for the millennial generation now, that are going to be leading us very soon when people like you and I are in retirement. And getting it right to me means the following, Craig, and it answers your question, I hope. Number one, we're in a highly competitive phase with China right now. And frankly, it's not a partisan issue in the United States. Most Republicans and most Democrats agree with President Trump that China has been violating economically its World Trade Organization commitments. It's been ripping off the intellectual property of a lot of American firms, and that's the gold standard for a lot of American firms. It's that knowledge, it's the patent, and they've been doing it illegally. And so therefore, we've got to get tougher with China on trade. Most people agree with that. Number two, the Chinese have been under Xi Jinping very assertive militarily, running roughshod out over Vietnam and the Philippines and Taiwan in the Spratly and Paracel Islands of the South China Sea. And the U.S. needs to, we're not going to fight China militarily, but we need to weigh in on behalf of those countries politically and help them to deal with this Chinese threat. They're taking on the American military, not in terms of a war, but trying to push our carrier battle groups off the coast of Asia through their ballistic missiles and their blue water navy and submarines. There's a big struggle for who's going to be the most powerful Navy and Air Force, the US or China. And I think the third area, in addition to the economic and military competitions, is really ideological. It is quite reminiscent of the Cold War with Mao and with the Soviet Union. Xi Jinping is an authoritarian leader, obviously. He believes in the future of authoritarian dictatorial rule worldwide. And he doesn't believe in the future of democracy. And we need to stand up to him in that rhetorical battle and defend democracy and defend our values and our system. So we're in a very competitive phase, which is not going to end. But you've asked a really good and sophisticated question: can we also cooperate with them? And the answer has to be, if we're the two leading carbon emitters on climate change, we're going to have to work with China. If we're the two leading global economies with the European Union, we're going to have to work with China to prevent a Great Depression. And on the coronavirus, we're the two countries with real capacity to help the world cope. And so we're going to have to cooperate with China in all those areas. And what it means is we're going to have to balance between these competing objectives every single day and week. We're competing in some spheres, we're going to have to cooperate with others. And I think that's probably the wisest course for any Republican or Democratic president, whether it's President Trump in a second term or President Biden in a first term. And I think we need to avoid demonizing China so much in the media and in our politics, especially in our politics, that we'll be able to cooperate when it's in the self-interest of the United States to do so. And that means there'll be times when we need to compromise with China, and there'll be times when we need to stand firm and not compromise, depending on the issue. This is what diplomacy is all about. And to do this, you need a president and a Secretary of State, but particularly the president, who has deep knowledge of the issues and deep knowledge of China, who is sophisticated in the way he or she acts in the world. And I know I'm probably sounding very political in saying this, but we're in an election year, and Pennsylvania is one of the key states. Joe Biden is that president, in my judgment. He's wise, he has experience, he's sophisticated, and I think we know a lot about President Trump. I don't think he's serving the country well.
So let's stay with the political question, and particularly the political question related to China. It seems very clear that an anti-China stance will be a key feature of the Trump campaign, particularly really blaming the spread of the pandemic on Chinese behavior. Is it possible for Vice President Biden to take this more cooperative approach to China in the campaign, or would that be political suicide?
I think that Vice President Biden has the right mix of toughness and realism about the China problem. He's been, as you know very well, he's from the state next door in Delaware. He's had 40 odd years of experience at the top of the U.S. government as vice president, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, senator from Delaware. There are few people in the country who can match his foreign policy experience. So I trust him to get the balance right. He is very tough-minded and is willing to go toe-to-toe with the Chinese when necessary. But he has a lot of common sense and street smarts and wisdom. He'll know when to cooperate with China, for instance, on climate change. And that's what President Obama and Xi Jinping did in 2015. They led the way for the entire world to sign the Paris Climate Change Agreement. You know, there are 195 nation states in the world, and there are 194 nation states in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. I think we all know the one country that refuses to be part of it, the United States. And Vice President Biden has said he'd put the United States right back into that climate change agreement because it's good for us. And it serves America well, and it helps Americans to live in a safer world and to do something about climate change. One more example of this, Craig, from the past couple of weeks. I think it's clear that President Trump is going to run against China in the campaign and blame China for the pandemic and the performance of the American government in the pandemic. And that's just not going to wash. People can see what happened. It was the decisions of our federal government, the lack of planning, the fact that we were late to work with the states on the lockdowns and social distancing that caused the major part of the problem. And when the president blames the World Health Organization and then withdraws American funding from it, it's like withdrawing funding from the fire department in the middle of the fire when the house is burning down. There'll be plenty of time when the coronavirus pandemic is over to assess the World Health Organization. It did not do everything right. It failed in some ways, but the time to do that is when we've got time to do it. Right now, there is a 5-alarm fire around the world, and we ought to be supporting the World Health Organization to help the Brazilians and to help the Indians to cope with this and to help the scientists and doctors to have a place to come together.
Let me stay with China for just one last question and kind of look out a little further on the horizon. As you well know, the Chinese Communist Party has pledged reunification with Taiwan by any means necessary and by a relatively short duration of time into the future, calling it inevitable just recently and saying that Taiwan is running out of time to discuss peaceful reunification. There are, as you've described, there are shifting military realities in the region. I've seen a number of war games guarding the straits between the mainland and Taiwan. And frankly, they show the United States loses that engagement if we tried to protect Taiwan from Chinese military intervention. Do you think the United States can maintain the objective of deterrence of China in terms of its policy towards, can we credibly say that we can deter China in there? Or do we need to really just say, this is not our fight and we have to stand back from it?
Well, Craig, you are asking tough questions, and I credit you for that. These are among the toughest issues that our government deals with, and so I thank you for asking them. I just say a couple things. First, there's no question that the United States should stay with the decision that President Nixon made back in 1972, that we recognize and have official diplomatic relations only with the People's Republic of China, and we do not with Taiwan. We do not have an official relationship. It's the one China policy that, given the weight of China in the world and given the complexities of the US-China relationship, it makes sense to stay with that policy. Having said that, however, Taiwan is a remarkable place. It is a very successful democracy. It has one of the best records, by the way, of dealing with a pandemic over the last 3 or 4 months, the very best records. Its vice president is an epidemiologist and a public health expert, and that helped them to get through this and make the right decisions. During the recent Taiwanese elections, there was a massive cyber assault by the Chinese intelligence and military organs against Taiwan, and the Taiwanese found a way to defend themselves and fight off the Chinese in the cyber battles, really in terms of social media platforms. So the Taiwanese can teach us some lessons about the Russians and Chinese invading our elections in 2020. And I think that it is incumbent on the United States to continue to sell defensive weaponry to the Taiwanese so they can defend themselves. Taiwan's going to be a very tough nut. These people love their democracy. They do not want to be reincorporated by physical force back into the People's Republic of China. And if the Chinese ever tried a military invasion, there would be a huge cost to the Chinese in terms of world public opinion. It would be naked aggression. It would be a cost politically in terms of potential sanctions that the Chinese would have to think about. And frankly, the Chinese might be better off just letting things lie as they are. Taiwan is independent of the People's Republic of China, and yet there is real trade between them. And there are people moving back and forth. They've probably been they're more connected now, Taiwan and the People's Republic, than at any time since 1949, when the nationalists lost the civil war to Mao in China. And so I'm not with those who think that an invasion of Taiwan is imminent. And Taiwan's going to be a very tough opponent if there's some kind of invasion. The Chinese have to calculate all this. Say one thing about the Chinese government. I don't agree with their government very much. I'm an opponent of their government as an American patriot. And yet there's a very rational leadership there in Beijing. I don't think they'll do anything in the short term that is not going to be in the interest of the government of China. So maintaining the status quo might be their best option.
I want to talk about a couple other hotspots in the world and how the current crisis affects those things. The virus has hit hard in Iran. And some are arguing that it could be the straw that breaks the camel's back of the Ayatollah regime, with popular support for that regime having waned in recent years, even before this. Do you think there's any truth to that? And either way, what do you think U.S.-Iran relations would look like going forward if there was a Biden administration?
This is a very important issue. First, I think we missed an opportunity here from a humanitarian perspective. I think we should have offered our government to have sent humanitarian aid to the people of Iran back in February. Before we were hit hard in March, the Iranians were hit very hard, massive loss of life, as you noted, Craig. And we didn't do that, and I wish we had, because this is a time to put enmity and differences aside. We should want to help the people of Iran, not the government, but the people. And we could have been part of that. Second, I'd say I have given up predicting when the Iranian government is going to fall. This is a very tough, authoritarian, cynical group of people. And we don't like them very much in our country because they're anti-American and they've conducted a number of terrorist attacks against Americans. But they're survivors. I know a lot of people think that the government's on the rope because the Iranian people are outraged that their government wasn't well prepared. Their public health system wasn't strong. And yet, I think they've got the military in particular, the Revolutionary Guards, have such a grip on the intelligence apparatus and on the police force. I find it hard to believe the government's going to fall. Certainly, Vice President Biden has said, and you will not be surprised to hear this, it was a great mistake for Donald Trump to take us out of the Iran nuclear deal. I was not part of the Obama administration, but I testified before Congress 4 times in favor of the deal back in 2015. I said to the members of the Senate and House, it's not a perfect deal, but it does tie the Iranians up in knots, Gordian knots, for the next 20 to 30 years. And that to me was better than a nuclear armed Iran. Vice President Biden has stated many times it was a major mistake to take us out of that agreement. But he and many of the rest of us have been very critical of what the Iranian government's doing to be such a destabilizing force in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, where, as you know, they've been supporting Hezbollah against the state of Israel. And Israel's our friend and partner. And in Gaza, when they're in their support of Hamas. So I don't think there's much disagreement in Washington on this second issue, Craig, that America should be trying to help the Israelis and the Gulf Arab states and Jordan and Egypt contain Iranian troublemaking in the Middle East. The disagreement is on the nuclear deal. Frankly, President Obama's plan was so much more effective than anything President Trump has done.
Let's turn to Russia. Also extremely hard hit by the pandemic. In fact, it appears that it's quite out of control there at the moment. Question to you as to whether or not you think that calls into question the stability of the Putin regime, which has been based on a kind of a bargain with the people that they would have so at least modestly rising living standards, and they would have sort of efficient, if not humanitarian government, and that they would have sort of glory on the world stage restored to them. Has the pandemic kind of maybe broken some of that bargain between Putin and the Russian people and put him somewhat at risk? And then sort of the other half of that question that I'd like to probe is U.S.-Russian relations. So we've learned now that President Trump intends to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty, another arms control agreement with Russia and other parties. I guess there's been this question that people have been discussing for a few years now of, on the one hand, President Trump is very publicly supportive of President Putin and talks constantly about a desire for better relations, warmer relations with Russia. But a number of the actions of the Trump administration have been what people would call hard line, including withdrawing from some of these arms control agreements like the INF Treaty and now Open Skies. So how do you see both events in Russia unfolding, and what is your view of how President Trump actually views U.S.-Russian relations?
Well, thank you. And I think we should have a lot of sympathy for the people of Russia. They're going through right now, as you stated, Craig, correctly, what we went through in the middle part of March and to the middle part of April, with huge numbers of people infected with the coronavirus and a lot of people dying, and not a lot of public health capacity, especially in some of the smaller Russian cities outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's a real tragedy to see this. And obviously, you know, our hearts go out to the Russian people. Having said that, I guess I'd give you the same answer on Putin that I gave on the Iranians. Putin has a grip on the Russian government. He's a KGB guy. He has total control of the intelligence apparatus, of the military. He's an authoritarian dictator, much in the way that Xi Jinping is. And I find it very hard to believe in a country that has really very little tradition of democratic rule, only the 1990s, the period of President Yeltsin's tenure when they had a true democracy. This is a country that unfortunately has been afflicted with authoritarian governments all the way back well before Peter the Great to Kievan Rus in the 11th century. And so I don't think you're going to see some kind of overthrow of the Putin regime. It would be a great thing for Russia if that happened, but I don't think you'll see that. I do think Russia, along with China, is one of those countries with which we have an incredibly difficult, complicated relationship. President Trump's administration has said quite correctly that the most important priority now, national security priority of the United States, is to counter the power of the authoritarian governments, China and Russia. And I think that that's a correct judgment to make, that that's the greatest threat to the American people. We need to contain Putin in Eastern Europe. That's why we have NATO. That's why we have NATO troops in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, our 4 NATO allies that are right on the Russian border. I think we are containing Putin successfully. We have no such security commitments to Ukraine or Georgia because they're not members of NATO, nor should we fight for those countries. But what President Obama did correctly, and Angela Merkel, was to sanction Putin for stealing Crimea from the government of Ukraine and annexing it, and for what he's done in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. So a real problem with the Russians there. But then again, it gets complicated in diplomacy, just like with China. We need to work with Russia to contain Iran's nuclear program and work with Russia to contain Kim Jong-un and the North Korea nuclear program. And in terms of counter narcotics, narcotics trafficking rings, we can also work with the Russians because we're both victims of that internationally. And so international politics is not black and white. It's not zero sum. You are competing with countries, we are, like China and Russia most of the time, but you also try to cooperate. That means you keep the diplomatic links open. We have an ambassador in Moscow, John Sullivan, a very good person, a very good appointment by President Trump. And President Trump ought to be talking to Putin on the issues where we disagree. And my fear is that President Trump has been weak with Putin. He's not really taken Putin on the issues where he should have, in defending our allies in Eastern Europe, for instance, and standing up for them. So that's my beef with President Trump. I think he's just too weak, too much of a pushover for Putin. And Putin's a very cynical, powerful, dominating kind of person. You need to speak truth to power, as Condi Rice did, as George W. Bush did, as Barack Obama did. I don't think President Trump has the skills and, frankly, mental toughness or guts to stand up to Putin.
So I've got two more questions, and then we'll go to our audience. I want to ask whether you think the pandemic overall is going to end up helping or hurting the cause of global action on climate change. So on the one hand, the pandemic sort of proves to a lot of people's minds that very dire warnings by scientists really can come true. And it also proves that there are issues that simply can't be constrained within national borders, that are truly global in dimension. But on the other hand, when you have a global quarantine resulting in an economic collapse, and yet we've only had carbon emissions decline by 17%, figure I saw the other day. Won't that fact convince people, a lot of people at least, that there is simply no affordable way to decarbonize? I mean, what more could we do to lessen economic activity than we've already done? So which way do you think it ends up coming out?
I think that most Americans, when we have time to reflect on this, once the virus has passed, and hopefully once the recession has bottomed out and we're beginning to see some hope in our economy, I think they're going to reflect on these last few months and say, there are certain issues where the United States cannot live as an island, separate from everybody else. Put it another way, in the 21st century, I think we're finding that there are some issues where the fate of everybody on Earth is linked together. 7.7 billion people. Climate change is one of them. Pandemics are another. This is the 4th pandemic in 17 years. SARS 2003, H1N1 2009, Ebola 2014, now coronavirus 2020. There's every reason to believe there'll be more of these pandemics in the future. We know, those of us who believe in the science, and that's most Americans, they believe in the science. We know that climate change is real and it's going to worsen. And so I actually think these events that have affected all of us very profoundly, we've all had to self-isolate, we've all had to worry about our aging parents or kids, whatever it is, friends, that we've got to be outward looking and globally oriented on some issues like climate and pandemics. It's the only way to defend ourselves. We can't defend ourselves if we're acting alone. And that, Craig, that means that we need to believe in science. We need to believe in empiricism. We've been believing in science since the Renaissance. And if you think of the founders of the United States, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Dolly Madison, Abigail Adams, they were all empiricists. They were all part of the movement that understood that science is the basis of life on Earth, that you've got to be data-driven and empirical-driven. And there are certain parts of our political system, mainly on the extremes, mainly the far, far right, that rejects science, rejects experts, rejects facts. They got us into a lot of trouble in the coronavirus when they wouldn't believe Dr. Fauci or Dr. Birx or the epidemiologists at Penn or Villanova. And so to me, that's the great lesson of what just happened to us. I have a brother who's a doctor at Children's Hospital, two nieces, his two daughters, who are both doctors in Boston hospitals. I've been kind of living this through them. And they're data-driven people. They're people who believe, they're scientists, they're medical doctors. And I think that's the great lesson for Americans. Reject those people who think they can rule by gut, not by our brains and not by science.
Okay, last question from me at this point. If you were Secretary of State today, or perhaps on January 21st, 2021, what would you be telling America's diplomats around the world was their top priority?
Well, I'm not going to be Secretary of State on January 1st, 2021. That's going to be someone else. But here's what I'd say to answer your very good question, and a very good question to end on before we go to the audience questions. I would say to the great men and women of the State Department, we need you more than any other time in the history of the last 4 or 5 decades. This is a time for diplomacy to prevent the next pandemic and to work with other countries on it, to do something about climate change, to avoid a war with China and yet be competitive with China. And the same goes with Putin. This all requires men and women who understand the world, who understand foreign languages, who are willing to live on our behalf in all those countries and our embassies and consulates and represent us. I think their work, this is my brethren of the career foreign service, I was in the career foreign service, is now as important as it's ever been. And we need good young women and good men to join the foreign service. I know you have some high school and college students listening and watching tonight. I would encourage them to think about a life of public service. And if diplomacy and foreign affairs is not what they want to do, teaching in our elementary schools and the Peace Corps and being a hospital orderly or a nurse or a doctor, that's all public service. And we need people like that. So I'm really proud of the State Department, of the Career Foreign Service, but they've had a tough time. President Trump has tried to cut their budget by 1/3 and then 1/4 in the last 2 years. He's fired a number of our senior diplomats without cause. He's accused the State Department of being the deep state, which is deeply offensive for these nonpartisan people to hear. And you may remember the name Masha Yovanovitch and Bill Taylor and George Kent, 3 of the great Foreign Service officers who testified because Congress sent a subpoena to them in the impeachment inquiry. I really think Americans saw, a lot of people told me when they saw those Foreign Service officers, they said, boy, we didn't know the high caliber of these people, the nonpartisan behavior of these people. And I think those Foreign Service officers acquitted themselves very well. So you've obviously hit a nerve and a chord with me. The Foreign Service is so embattled. It needs much greater support. And I've launched a project at Harvard to think through the future of the Foreign Service. I'm working with 3 other retired American ambassadors. We're going to do this in a nonpartisan way. We're going to issue the report after the American election. We'll work with Republicans and Democrats to try to build up our career service because, appropriately, we've supported our great military, but we've not supported financially or even with political attention the State Department. We're going to need them more in the future than we have in the past.
Thank you. Well, your last answer very well anticipates the first question from a member of our audience. Mary, I don't know if I'm going to get this last name pronunciation right, Mary Brody, I believe, writes, I have met several usually younger Foreign Service officers who have resigned as they're so discouraged by America First diplomacy and President Trump. I've been working with some local Peace Corps evacuees to encourage them to take the Foreign Service exam and to have more opportunities with that than usual. What else can be done to ensure that we retain talented young Foreign Service officers?
Well, Mary, thank you for that question. And I thank you for your support of the Foreign Service. I'm also encouraging my students. I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School, and we have 1,000 students, and many of them want to go into public service. I've been encouraging them, no matter how difficult it is for civil servants in Washington these days, because there hasn't been a lot of respect for them in this administration. We need you in the government, and we need you there for a full career. So I think you're right to encourage the young people that you're talking to, high school and college students, to take the Foreign Service exam. You need to be 2 things to be a Foreign Service officer or take the exam: 21 years of age and an American citizen. You don't need to have any other credentials. And I'd take the exam, see what happens. If you pass, great, you move forward in the process of hiring. If you don't pass, just take the exam again. That's what happened to me way back in 1978. I failed the exam and I thought my career was over, my career ambitions were finished. And one of my professors said, take the exam again. And so fortunately, that was good advice, and I did. Morale has sunk to the lowest level that I can remember, and I go back to 1980 as an intern in Nouakchott, Mauritania, in West Africa with the State Department. Morale is low because the president is fired, and the Secretary of State have fired some of our most senior Foreign Service officers. They've tried to cut the budget. They haven't shown respect. Traditionally, about 70% of our ambassadors worldwide are career and 30% are political appointees. We're the only country in the world that has political appointees. The Trump administration, barely half of its ambassadors are career. So they have the lowest level of career ambassadors since well before the Second World War. And it's tough. People are leaving in droves. There's been an exodus at the senior level, the mid-level, and the junior officer level. I've had former students of mine go into the Foreign Service and leave and come back to Harvard and elsewhere because, for a variety of reasons, but a lot of them just didn't feel the respect was there for our career civil servants. And I can tell you this, the final thing I'd say, Mary and Craig, on this one, we have a nonpartisan federal workforce. I know that President Trump accuses all of them of being Obama appointees. Well, they were Obama appointees and Bush appointees and Clinton appointees. They've served every president. And we need to have a group of civil servants, as well as in the military, who will not be partisan, who will not belong to either party, but just serve the American people and be restricted from being in politics, which the law says that they have to be restricted. And in my experience in government, no one ever asked me who I voted for. No one would have dreamed of doing that. It made sense to me that I'd served both President Reagan as well as President Clinton, George W. Bush, and then as well as his predecessors. I went on to become a part of Secretary Kerry's advisory board in a Democratic administration after my retirement. It's normal for people like us to think that we'd serve both parties, and I think President Trump is really damaging that nonpartisan ethos by accusing everybody of being against him when all of them just want to serve this administration and he won't let them. It's really a tragedy to see what's happening. And we've got to save the Foreign Service, hopefully after the defeat of President Trump in November.
Thank you. Next question is from Sanjay Verma, who says, the current US-China situation has evolved over many years, even before Trump. If you could turn time back, what are some of the things that you would or would not have done in the period before Trump?
Worldwide, Sanjay, I guess he's saying. What are some of the issues where I would have done something different? Counseled something
I think particularly with reference to China.
to China. I was just going to say a non-China issue, and hindsight's always 2020. I supported the Iraq War in 2003. I was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, and I supported it professionally, but also personally. I thought it was the right decision. And with the benefit of hindsight and deep introspection myself, I wish very much I had been smarter, thought more about the downside consequences of invading and occupying an Arab nation. I think that was a great mistake. I have a lot of respect for George W. Bush, by the way, to this day. He did a lot of good things as president, and he's a very fine person. But this was a big mistake, which we are still paying for. And I think one of the lessons of my career, which I've tried to impart to students, and I didn't get a lot of these issues right while I was in the career, I'm not saying that, but as I reflect in my career, we've got to be very careful about the use of military power. There are times we have to defend ourselves. We did after 9/11. We were right to go into Afghanistan, but then we got stuck there, going on 20 years next year. And we didn't really have an exit strategy, and that was a mistake. Iraq was a mistake. With China, I think the big mistake with China, frankly, was we let them into the World Trade Organization. This was President Clinton who did this in the 1990s as a developing country. And then China was becoming then and has since become the greatest manufacturing and export power in the world. And yet it's treated like a developing country in terms of trade. And too many American presidents, President Obama, President George W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, they let China get away with too much, ripping off of American intellectual property. And we lost a lot of American jobs. And here I'm an opponent of President Trump, but I must say, I think his basic diagnosis that we've got to be tougher at the negotiating table with China is correct. I don't think he's done very well because he tried to go it alone, Craig. He tried to go mano a mano with the Chinese on trade. If we had enlisted the European Union and Japan to help us leverage the Chinese, because they all have the same problems we do. Well, the European Union, the United States, and Japan is well over half of global GDP. That would have been a powerful lever, but the president doesn't believe in these alliances and coalitions. So I think he wasn't smart about the way he negotiated, but that would be another decision, Sanjay, that I would point to by someone I deeply admired. And I worked for President Clinton in the White House, and I still admire him, but no president is perfect. I think you'd take back that decision of inviting China to join the World Trade Organization. You'd ask a lot more of China. We'd be a lot more tough-minded about China on the economic side.
Okay, our last question, actually it's a two-parter, comes from Andy Zabo, who says, considering that both China and the United States both came around late to protecting their own citizens, is one country or the other viewed more positively or negatively by countries other than the United States and China in terms of the pandemic? And then number two, if Joe Biden is elected, will the State Department see an incoming flow of resumes to serve?
On the second question, I think absolutely. There is huge respect for Joe Biden by career professionals, people who have worked in defense policy, the military, and people like me who've worked in the foreign service and in diplomacy. People just want to serve, and they want to serve their country. I think we'll have an onslaught of young people coming out of our universities like yours and your great universities in Philadelphia, and they'll want to serve the government because just like Barack Obama or George H.W. Bush or John F. Kennedy, they really felt that government service was noble and that people, all Americans had during their lifetime have an obligation to serve the country. President Trump has not made that call. He's politicized the government and disregarded the civil servants. So I think, yes, I think Joe Biden will be a great magnet for all sorts of young people who want to serve in government. Eli, on your first question, what a great question. I would say this. if you look around the world and try to judge, okay, which governments performed really well in the pandemic and which did not, I'm getting consistent reviews from people all in the world that a lot of mid-sized countries, almost all democracies, did really well. South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Austria, Denmark, Israel, all acted very quickly, decisively, clear instructions, data-driven from the government, where they put the scientists and epidemiologists out front and kind of lived by their decisions. And there was great societal buy-in. I was talking to a group of Israelis. I've talked to 2 groups of Israelis this week on Zoom, big groups. I think on Tuesday, they did not have a single case, not a single infection of the coronavirus in the state of Israel, and very few infections and deaths in the Palestinian territories because they acted early and they were clear and they were consistent. Which governments did not do that? Russia, China, the United States of America, Brazil. 4 big countries, so it's harder to, to be effective when you have several hundred million people over several million people, but still the lesson is Germany with 80 million people. And my daughter lives in Germany, our daughter, she's been reporting back calm, decisive, fact-based Angela Merkel. People believed in her, and so they stayed inside. And they didn't petition like some of the, I think, unfortunate demonstrations we've seen in Michigan with people with guns storming the state capitals to end the social distancing and the lockdowns when the great majority of Americans observed the social distancing. They followed the rules. You didn't see that in Germany, that kind of dissonance that we saw in the United States. You didn't see the president. Craig, I thought the most shameful thing the president did was to say in the middle of the pandemic when people were dying in great numbers, liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia, going after the Democratic governors, but not the Republican governors, playing politics, contradicting his own government's policy that asked us to stay indoors. And you just contrast the successful governments versus the unsuccessful. May we have a successful national effort the next time. It won't be with Donald Trump, but it could be with Joe Biden. And I deeply believe this is the most important election of our lifetime. The future of our country is at stake. And I just hope that all of us will seriously consider your vote. I wouldn't tell people how to vote, but I just wanted to tell people how I felt about it. As a foreign policy person, I think the future of our country is riding on what happens on November 3rd.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, we thank you for being with us, for your time, your insights, your opinions. I want to thank our audience for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully you'll come back for future of these web events as we explore a variety of issues facing our country today. For this evening, everyone stay safe and have a great Memorial Day weekend, and we are adjourned.
Thank you, Craig.